Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bob Cohen, Vice President of Marketing at Basware, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Future of Accounts Payable webinar, the top 5 changes coming to accounts payable. Along with Tom Flynn from Lavante, we're going to be talking about what we've seen in the marketplace and the changes that we see coming in the future and what AP is going to look like in the future. We often get asked, and this is a series that the Future of AP is an idea that Tom and I kind of came across. We see each other at a lot of events, conferences, and we kind of came across this idea about 2 years ago on what the future of AP would look at. And Tom and I spend a lot of time talking to analysts, going to conferences, talking to customers and prospects, and we see what's going on today. And a lot of people ask us and say, what does the future look like? What does tomorrow look like? We have this problem today. We have really bad supplier information management. We have manual processes. Things are getting lost. We know we want to get rid of that problem today, but what does the future look like? So we kind of came across the idea, well, why don't we put together a presentation garnered from these conversations we had with analysts like Paystream and Gartner, Forrester, Ardent Partners, etc. And that's how we came across this. And we've actually been running a series of seminars across the country, and we'll list some at the end of the presentation on cities that we're coming to next. But these have been extremely successful. We kind of have a very good interaction with clients and to talk about what they're doing today and what their goals are. So we're going to do a webinar today kind of on the same premise that we're doing for the seminar. We thought we'd put together the 5 biggest changes that we saw coming to accounts payable. That's really what the gist of this presentation is. I'm going to turn this over to Tom, who's going to start it off with the first of the 5 points that we see coming to accounts payable.
So these 5 changes that we see are listed on the page here. We have an increased attention to the supplier information management realm, a new focus or a rejuvenated focus on supplier network, increased collaboration between buyers and suppliers, obviously increased levels of AP automation, get into some details and how to become a real leader in the space for cost of transactions, etc. And then also the thought process of getting your finance and your procurement departments working more closely together. The first thing we want to focus on here is that increased attention to accurate supplier information. And to do that, I always like to do a decade look back over the field of MDM, which is Master Data Management. And one of the first touchstone reports that I sort of investigated was this report by the Data Warehousing Institute back in 2001. Now, this was a long and varied report, pulled a lot of information, and I'm not doing it justice by just reducing it down to 2 bullets. But some of the net from this report was that they discovered U.S. businesses lost more than $600 billion a year based on poor data quality. Now, keep in mind, we're not yet in the P2P space. We're not talking about the master vendor file yet. We're talking about overarching master data management for a whole organization. But this still is the first shades of a discussion about how can you quantify the cost of bad data and how can you start fixing it. What was interesting is at the time, half of the respondents had no plans in place to improve the data quality in their organization. So a couple years go by, there's several reports that had taken place, but I go to 2006 where we really started to see an uprising of the attention that analysts were paying to the master data management space. And I think the quote on the page kind of speaks for itself. This is one of many quotes that kind of came in that 3 or 4 or 5 year block of time. And it was a Gartner report, and the meat of it was that companies really needed to develop a methodology that would allow their organization to execute successful data quality. In some of these reports, these analysts were talking about how to quantify the data and what it was costing an organization. Again, it was still at the master data management level. So we come to 2009, and in a really interesting study, sponsored in part by Pitney Bowes and run by the Chartered Quality Institute, it found a whole host of discoveries about master data management. Now, there's a lot of bullets on this page here. I'm going to focus on 2 of them. The final bullet here on this cell here says that 17% of the respondents had no plans to initiate a solution. Now, just point of fact for this presentation, it was over 1,000 companies in the enterprise space across the U.S. and the UK that were doing at least $1 billion in sales and revenues. So this is a pretty large swath of companies, and you can see where 17% had no plan. So that's a marked improvement over 2001. So you can see the attention that people were putting on master data management was kind of paying off, and people now have that on their radar. But the more telling bullet on this slide is what I put in bold here, that only 4% of companies, or only 4% of respondents, said that their data quality was excellent. Now, that's an interesting slide because everybody in the AP space or the P2P space is trying to achieve excellence, operational excellence or transactional excellence. And it's very difficult to achieve that level of excellence if you don't really have excellent data populating your environment. So let's move to 2011. I'd like to give a lot of credit to the spend management report, which was focusing on the dirty little secrets of overcoming dirty supplier data. And it started to quantify the impact of bad vendor data. This is a report that I think is very good. I would recommend people going online to see spendmatters.com and take a look at the bottom line was, and this was probably pretty obvious, but this is something people were learning from, is data can be put into a system with the best intentions and the best processes, but as it aged, it really decayed over time, and that made data excellence very difficult. So this is what came out of the report. We now see the concept of data management moving into the P2P space, and it starts to get quantified. We have a couple different presentations that we travel with at Lavante. One of the presentations is completely about quantifying the cost of poor data quality. And I have a couple bullets listed on the page here. You can see where from the very start it's important to identify what data quality is costing you as an organization. The spend management document talks about the cost of poor data quality in the P2P process, but internally, if you were going to look at a data quality solution for your own department, you'd want to start quantifying where it's costing you, and that might be reissuing checks or time spent on vendor issues, et cetera, et cetera. There's obviously compliance implications with SOX and OFACs, et cetera. And also, there's the question of, does having poor visibility into your data environment open up the possibility for fraud? Now, obviously, this is a whole Pandora's box that we're not talking specifically about fraud on this call. We're happy to entertain that offline or to dive more into that in some of our other presentations. But again, it gets into what is the data quality costing us. I have some simple, really simple examples here. This is actually from some of the work that we do. And you can see when we're dealing with a client's supplier population, we can see two labels or two vendors that somebody sets up. And let's just focus on example one. You can see in earnest, maybe the naming convention that you have at your environment might catch this, but A space ampersand space W products versus A ampersand W products co. That might show up as two different companies. Even by all accounts, it's the same company. And there's a whole host of things that can arise by duplicate payments. Maybe your spend is at a much higher level than you're anticipating, so you're missing a discount or a rebate or pricing leverage. And even though it looks like you've done a good job setting these vendors up, that still is a data quality issue. It's important that these silent killers can really cost an organization a lot of money. And of course, I've listed another example as well. So with that, if you're able to achieve some sort of improvement in your supplier information, you might look at other more advanced levels of how do you control your supplier data. And one thing we're focusing on, and we're hearing a lot of buzz about, when Bob and I talk about being at the hub of all these very smart people, the end users, the analysts, the experts, one thing that always comes up is how do we best leverage a supplier network, or how do we get our suppliers into a place where people can start learning more about them. And it becomes a really important discussion about what would a supplier network look like, and how can you create a single undisputed point of truth, a source of truth that you can go to on a consistent basis and understand who are you buying from, who you should buy from, what's the best way to get connected with them, what's the most efficient way to buy from them. And at this point, when we talk about a supplier network, I like to use a couple of analogies. A very simple analogy I use when people maybe push back on a supplier network work or the socialization of the supplier population is the Amazon.com analogy. Most of the people on the phone are probably readers or have bought something on Amazon.com. And Amazon.com has created a social network where if you're going to buy a book, you don't just buy a book blind anymore. You can go onto Amazon and you can find out what are people rating it, what's the book about. You can see if there's any people who review books on a consistent basis, what do they like and what do they think about the book you want to buy. And the same concept of a network, it can do the same things. Maybe not as much and as quickly, but the concept of being able to put suppliers on a network and getting the access to that information immediately is where the future of AP is going. It's just a question of, getting it right, and sorting through that information and giving people a platform to have these open dialogues about who are the people we're buying from, how do we do it more effectively, what does their profile look like. Bob, I know your company and you're specialists in creating supplier networks. Is there anything you'd like to add at this point, sort of about your experience with the network conversation?
Thanks, Tom. Everyone looks at supplier networks. We really don't think about, who our suppliers are and they're really a network. But when you start to think about, the people that you buy from and then the people that you sell to, whether you're selling a service or producing some good that can be bought and sold, you really have a network. So it's really, as you look to the future, when we talk to all the analysts, you need to start thinking that way. Who's in our network? Who are our suppliers and who are our customers, and how do we all create this network? And one example that we kind of talk about is, when you have a kind of a closed network, if you think back to the way back machine of, 7-8 years ago with cell phones, and you were on the AT&T or Verizon network, and you could call people on that network easily and without any additional charges. You just call those people. But when you wanted to call somebody on a different network, be it you were on AT&T and you're trying to call somebody from Verizon or somebody from Sprint or something else, it was much more difficult. So you actually incurred charges because they were in a different network and they weren't part of your network because they were separate networks. But things have moved today so that we have a much more open networking kind of concept here, and everything is much more interrelated. So now when you call other networks, you don't need your 5 best friends, as they used to have on one thing, and you can only call your kids, and then it got much more expensive to call other people. Now we're on a network which includes both friends and family and work and everything else. So kind of when you look at the network going forward, you have to kind of think of it from that perspective, is that everything we're doing today is a network, and we're becoming much more interconnected. Our networks are available 24/7. We're talking about AP here. Vendors, may work all day long in a shop producing something. We have one client who is produces wood byproducts. So they have people that work in the mill all day long, and literally they don't have any computers there with internet access. So they go home and they access the internet at night. Your network needs to be available 24/7. It needs to be something where it's really more self-service. So as you look into the future, this is what you kind of have to take a look at.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bob. And I know you're very passionate about a lot of those points and stuff. We could probably do a whole hour on network. We'll spare everybody that. But one thing I like, the thought of a network is, there's so many improvements that come from this. If you think back to the previous slide where I talked about only 4% of respondents to a survey said that their data quality was excellent, the interesting thing about a network is if you get everybody into a network sort of self-assessing and self-divulging information and keeping it fresh, that really is the only realistic strategy for achieving that type of excellence in data. Since data constantly degrades when it's in a system, since it's always changing and it's a very fluid concept, to have suppliers coming into a network and updating it, or people who work with those suppliers keeping it fresh, that's how you can finally achieve that type of excellence. And I did want to pull up an example from the Lavante system. I'll make this very quick, and I'll focus on just the aspect of how the network helps to leverage better communication. Here we have a blanked out client, it's Acme client, and we're bouncing them against other clients, and they're working with a supplier. AmerisourceBergen as a supplier. Well, everybody's going to work with one supplier or another. I mean, there's so much overlap in the supplier populations, but how you've set up that supplier might be totally different. You might have a Dropbox or a remit to address or no address at all. But to be able to go into a network and bounce against other types of companies or enterprises and see, hey, I'm not effectively able to get in touch with this supplier. How is another company getting in touch with the supplier? When I talk to that supplier, can I figure out if there are any other suppliers that are related to it so that I'm understanding what the full breadth of spend is, how to most quickly get in touch with them? That network gives you immediate access to information that would otherwise be unseen. And you can start connecting, you can kind of start connecting the dots. One real-life example, and I'll move through this very quick. This is a client that we worked with, and just some high level about this client. We serve them in the recovery arena. We actually did recovery for them. They were resistant to it in the beginning because they had done recovery before and they had found nothing, next to nothing. I'm going to say somewhere in the order of about a couple tens of thousands of dollars in recovery. And anyone who's familiar with the recovery industry, it just means we started a project with them. Their previous experience with the project was low results. And they said, there's no point in doing this, but if you really want to, you can. In this second block, what I want to point out is if you look at the percentage of suppliers that we were able to connect with, we were able to connect with 70% of their suppliers, which shocked them. They had grown so quick by so many acquisitions and so quickly setting up suppliers that they did not have good supplier data populating their database. Not only did we connect with over 2/3 of their suppliers, we were able to update data for 3/4 of their suppliers. We actually updated data for more suppliers than we could even talk to. And the punchline is, as a result, our particular product, which happened to be recovery, but it could be automation, it could be travel and expense, it could be an ERP system, it could be anything, we were able to have a really good experience with our output. We were able to recover a lot of dollars in terms of recovery, and it had everything to do with being able to leverage a network, update information, and give our clients access to suppliers where they did not have access before. And again, it transcends what we do. It's anything you're going to do is under a strict advantage by being able to communicate with your supplier population more readily. Now, with that, that's kind of a segue into another part of the 5 bullets about the future of AP that we feel very strongly about. And Bob, I know you're an expert on the concept of really maximizing buyer and supplier collaboration. Let me turn over this bullet over here to you, because I know you've done a lot of research on this. You have a lot of good stuff to say here.
Great, thanks, Tom. So we talked a little about better information. And if you go back to the accounting classes that you took in high school or college or whenever it may be, there's always that garbage in, garbage out perspective, and that's what kind of number 1 talked about here. And then we talked about, okay, once you got better data, because in the future you have to have better data because things are getting leaner and meaner. We have to find profits in everywhere, and they're squeezing things, and the only way you're going to do that is with better information. So then we looked at kind of the network. We talked about a little bit about what we see out there and what the analysts are talking about. Everything's a networked world. We hear about it. There's ads from every single company out there on television, on the news, and the press, being we're in a networked world. So now we're in a networked world. So what do we see next? And what do these guys, the analysts and the pundits talk about? They talk about increased buyer and supplier collaboration. It's not enough just to be in a network, but now your buyers and suppliers need to collaborate a little bit more. So with that, there comes challenges, obviously. Buyers have their wants and needs and their goals, and suppliers have theirs. What's interesting is that you think about it, in most cases, every organization is both a buyer and a supplier of something, because all of us produce something, and we may need raw materials for that, and somebody else buys that. So we sit on both sides of the fence here. But we're looking at it from an account payable perspective here, and we kind of sit in the middle here, kind of look at each of the different groups. So what are the kind of the challenges that each of these groups face here, and these ones look at them from their own perspective. So when you're looking at the AP side of the fence here in the lower left-hand corner here, we all hear that invoice processing costs are too high. The recurring invoice is the same bill we get every month. We have to process that. Why do we keep processing the same invoice every single month if it's the same amount? There's too many errors going on. We either get bad information, which goes back to point number 1 here, or people send us duplicate invoices. We don't know what to do with those things. If we take a look at the treasury side of the fence here, and kind of in the purple, in the cash flow and working capital management, without good visibility into what's going on, what accounts payable needs as far as a cash perspective to pay the bills, and what the purchasing group has purchased, the treasury folks in the middle here have a much more difficult time with cash flow and working capital. So, going forward, we're taking a look at each of these distinct constituencies, and they really have to work more closely together because the challenges of one really affect the other. If we start taking a look at the suppliers, as soon as someone buys something, finance and AP should be able to know about this because they know what the liabilities are so they can plan for it. So no longer do invoices show up when they're overdue or there's no time to process them because you didn't know anything about it. Going forward in the future, what we see is a world where you don't have 10 days visibility into an invoice when it shows up, but you might have 60 or 65 from the day that order is placed to the day that order is shipped to the day the good is received to the day that the invoice is received to the time it's paid. So as we go forward, we hear a lot of the folks talking about the challenges and how we have to really look much more in a networked world here. So, but with all these challenges, there's obviously a lot of, sorry about that. There's a lot of opportunities for buyers and suppliers collaborating with one another. So if we take a look at the buyer's side of the fence, when there's better collaboration between the two, as I mentioned, there's better visibility. No longer just 10 days. It's much more like, it can be 60 or 65 days from the time that's ordered, and that allows you to manage your cash much better and do a lot of other things with that money. So no longer you're sitting with a slush fund on hand here saying, how much money do I need on hand? Well, I'll have $5 million sitting in my account, depending on the size of organization you are, for those invoices that just show up, because I have no visibility into what my aging invoice report looks like. Now you know exactly how much money you need at any point in time, so you have better visibility. You're also working with, in the future when this collaboration is improved there, you're doing much better on the matching rates and eliminating the manual processes that go on here, because the information is better. You know about a purchase beforehand, and if there's a PO tied to it, you can do a 2- or 3-way match. Or, if there's no PO associated with it, you can go against a contract or set up business rules to help you process things straight through and only deal with the exceptions. On the supplier side, obviously, if you know what the buyer's needs are, you have better visibility into how much product, whether it's a good or a service, you're going to need in the future. So just kind of the benefits going on between the buyers and supplier collaboration is something that we're going to see, we're seeing now, but it's definitely something you're going to see much more in the future here. And talk about how buyers and suppliers can collaborate better. What we see is that through better connectivity, we talk about social networking. Tom talked about Amazon and social network there. We're all very familiar with LinkedIn and Facebook. But our suppliers, we need to have that network with our suppliers and have that communication between the buyers and suppliers. So if something, they have a question about something, you don't have to send an email and wait for someone to reply. You're kind of in this, social networking type atmosphere where you can send a message and get an instantaneous response to that. And then, as we talked about, if you have the better data from start to finish, then the collaboration becomes much more seamless and much more beneficial to both organizations that are here. So how can the connectivity and data improve your process? You kind of take a look at this. We kind of broke it down a little bit, to the 4 categories of, when you receive the data, what you do with that data, how you reconcile all that information. You take it from the payment and all the way through reviewing and reporting of that information here. So when you're talking about how you can improve the process, you talk about supplier enablement, enabling your suppliers to submit invoices electronically, one way or the other, because I think we can all agree that it's kind of strange that we take one electronic document and then in most cases print that off, use snail mail to physically mail it. Someone receives it on the other end, has to open it up, and then scans it in or manually enters the data back into another computer system. So we've taken X's and O's, ones and zeros, and printed them off and then re-entered them into the information. So we have to enable our suppliers to submit invoices, submit purchase orders all electronically. And we can do that through any number of different ways through, there's 50 different file formats that are out there. You should be able to submit using what you're comfortable with. Portal is something in the network that many of us are familiar with. Many of us use a portal at home to pay our own bills, but yet at work we're doing things manually. So I think that we'll see a little bit more of a penetration acceptance of web portals for submitting invoices and purchase orders at work, kind of like we do at home, with online banking. And then when you do what the data comes in, once again, if you're receiving the data electronically, then you can do much more validation, much more easily of the data because all the data is there ready for you and it's all in digital format. Whereas if you have to manually rekey or scan in an invoice and then manually correct all the inaccuracies of that data, it's a very time-consuming process. So the data reconciliation needs to be electronic. When it does, we'll see that the line-level validation is much easier to do. We can do automatic routing of invoices and only deal with the exceptions. We talked a little bit about on the payment side of the fence, when you have this better data, you're able to take discounts more. And, a lot of talk is out there about dynamic discounting, and that's actually an interesting conversation because dynamic discounting assumes that, when an invoice comes in, you can go back to that supplier and say, hey, if I pay this early, will you take 1% discount or 2% off the bill if I pay you today? And that's fine, but that's really should be the exception rather than the rule. If purchasing and finance are doing their jobs and doing a good job analyzing who their suppliers are and what they're buying and the cost of these goods, they should go back to their suppliers and say, hey, we want better terms right up front, so you don't leave it to the end of the day, when that invoice comes in to negotiate the terms, those terms are all negotiated up front, and that way they just flow straight through and there's no delay, and you know exactly what discounts you're going to receive and what volume discounts you're going to receive. So dynamic discounting is great, but really if you're doing the process up front, doing the work up front with most of your suppliers, it kind of becomes unnecessary. And then obviously, you know what I talked about there, transparency and analytics that come into play, and that's kind of all what I talked about there is, you know, once you have better collaboration, you have better visibility into what's going on, and you can be more analytical rather than reactive. The fourth change that, you know, we see coming here is increased levels of automation in AP. Now, some folks, you know, listening out there, you know, may be very automated. Some folks out there may be very manual. You know, so regardless where you are, I think there's an opportunity to increase that level of automation more. Obviously, if you're very paper-based out there, and you know, we run across lots of companies every day that, you know, still do things in a manual process, and they may be processing 500 invoices a month or 50,000 invoices a month or more, and they're doing it in a manual way. You know, so if that's you out there, you know, that's great. It's great that you're looking into accounts payable automation and what the future of AP looks like. And if you're already doing some automation, there's ways to kind of jack up what you're doing there and improve the levels of automation that you have. So let's kind of take a look at this a little bit. This was a study that was done in April of last year, and I think a new report's coming out shortly, again, that updates it this year. But it kind of just goes to the point there that, you know, we think in this day and age everyone is automated AP. Well, that's just not the case. You know, if we can see from Scott Pezza, who's an analyst at Aberdeen Research, in his report, they surveyed, I think it was 100 or 150 different clients there, and they said that over 77% of invoices still come in paper format. You know, and there's still a lot of manual processing going on. So, you know, we like to think we're talking about AP automation for many years now, you know, but some companies have adopted it and some haven't. And as you can see here, most of the invoices received are still paper-based. And I think we can all agree that, you know, paper-based manual entry of data is not the wave of the future. You know, so here's another chart from that same report that's out there. If anybody wants this report, I can send them a copy of this. You can just shoot us an email. Our contact information is at the end here. We can kind of take a look at the comparison of what's going on as far as levels of automation within AP, and you can see it's all over the place. You know, if you take a look at the laggards, it takes over 21 or almost 21 days to process a single invoice, and they estimated it cost them almost $40 to process an invoice. But if you look at the top 20%, they're calculating it takes them only 4 days. You know, or 1/5 of what it takes the laggards to process an invoice, and their costs are even less than that. So you can see there's a real value in automating AP, you know, and as I said earlier in the presentation, as we move forward, you know, AP is one of the places within an organization that may not have received the attention before. They automated other areas before, but I think you can see here from the charts, you know, there's some huge opportunity to prove the value of AP and prove the worth to the company by automating the accounts payable process. And this is something that, you know, you're going to be seeing a little bit more and more, I think, as one CFO from one company talks to another CFO at another company, and they're going to start saying, hey, you know, we've automated our AP processes, and, you know, we receive no paper, and they start talking and, you know, and kind of boasting about what they're doing, and he's talking to a CFO who's very manual. You know, there's going to be an impetus, you know, for that CFO to turn to his VP of Finance and Shared Service Director and say, you know, what are we doing? Why haven't we done this? So it's a great opportunity for you out there that haven't automated or haven't fully automated to kind of go back and say, hey, here's an opportunity for us to save some money for the organization and kind of show some real value add and make AP the driver that's there. You know, and as we do this, you know, we can talk about, you know, the changes in that role of AP. We go from reactive to proactive here. You know, so, you know, if you're dealing with paper here, you all are very familiar with what's on the left-hand side of the page here. You know, you're chasing papers around. Who's got this invoice? Why was it lost? You know, who's the last person to approve it? Et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you know that, you know, better than I do there. You have to go and find out, you know, was the information on the invoice correct? Did we actually order this information? Was the goods received? You know, you're really just responding. And one of the studies I heard is that a third to 40% of the calls into an unautomated organization in AP are from people inquiring about the status of that invoice. But once you automate, post-automation here, those calls coming in, you know, decrease significantly. They may go down to 0 to 10% of the calls coming in are inquiring about invoices, because now invoices get paid on time. So suppliers don't call into AP wondering about what's going on or send emails. They don't contact the people in the business units. So now there's much more time for that AP person to change kind of their role, and can now kind of take a look at those discounts we talked about. How can we improve the processes? How can we improve the throughput and the touchless processing that's going on? You become much more of a spend management analyst and advisor that's there. You can understand what we're buying and what we're selling, and kind of provide recommendations back to the organization. Once again, changing the role of AP in the future to be much more value add. We had one client who pre-automation, it's a retail store, and they had cleaning services that were working with stores in 10 different countries, as it were. It's one of our European clients. And pre-automation, they had contracts with the same cleaning company in these 10 different countries. And post-automation, they kind of ran some reports and realized that they were paying 10 different prices for the same service in 10 different countries. And they were by an order of magnitude of more than double what the cheapest company was charging them versus the most expensive company in that country. So they were able to kind of take a look at what their supplier was doing and go back to that supplier and say, hey, you're charging us all over the board for this. They're able to negotiate better terms across all the stores and actually ended up saving quite a bit of money for that organization.
Hey, Bob, one thing I would add to this, and it comes up in every one of our conversations when we're boots on the ground at this seminar series that I know you mentioned before. We have this curriculum. We take it to a lot of major cities. Something that comes when we get 40 people in a room and start talking about this, during the changing role of AP conversation, it's very exciting to talk about moving from a reactive to a proactive mindset. But there's an unintended parallel concept here, which is, what do you do with the staff or the workforce that has existed in sort of a tactical role and is now getting primed to move to that strategic role? Is everybody ready to make that jump? Can everybody make that jump? Can you support the same number of staff? And that's one of the questions that has to accompany this whole improvement process. I don't know. I think this usually is a more fluid and natural conversation with all the experts in the room sharing their ideas and what they've done. But that is something, if you get a chance to go to one of the seminars or to talk to another colleague before you go into an automation upgrade or anything that's going to improve the efficiency of your department, getting insight from people who've been there before about how do you take people by the hand and get them into that more strategic role. There's a lot of really good ideas and very empathetic ideas going around for how do you make your tactical people more strategic, and it's exciting to watch people share those ideas and bring out the best in each other.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we've seen that at a lot of different seminars, as you mentioned, Tom. I think, the truth of the matter is, hopefully you can work with the existing staff as you automate, kind of need less manual processing and make them more proactive. But the fact of the matter is, everyone may not be capable of making that jump. You may have somebody who's been doing data entry for you for many years, and and there's not a possibility, for them to move to something different in the organization. It's a tough, it's a tough conversation to have, and you have to figure out, how best to deal with those folks. But, some of the discussions we've had, as Tom mentioned, is, the train's coming down the track, and your CFO says, well, I've got 50 people in accounts payable, and he talks to the CFO next door, and he's got 20 people, or he's outsourced the process, So if you're not having these conversations, you're not thinking, as Tom said, what do we do with the staff we have? How do we move them into new roles? It may not be possible to move everybody into a new role, so you have to understand, how you work with that. But, ideally, you'd like to find something that everyone can do. But, if you're just sitting back going, well, we can't do anything with all these people, at some point in time, somebody in your organization higher up is going to go, well, we have 50 people here. Maybe we should just outsource the whole operation because we're inefficient. And, that's a conversation that we've heard from various people at our seminars who said this. And, one way to prevent outsourcing is by doing a better job, being more productive and more efficient in your organization, because you're not going to outsource something that's very efficient. You outsource typically inefficient operations. So, while it's something that may not be the easiest transition, it's something you do have to look at as you move into the future there. You want to do more with less, so what do you do with the people you have? Obviously, try to find them roles in the rest of the company somewhere else, but, it's a conversation you need to have. You can't avoid it, because at some point in time, there is going to be that train coming down the track from that CFO or VP of Finance who's going to ask that difficult question, and you want to be prepared for it. So kind of taking a look at, moving into the future and doing more with less. Here's kind of an example. It's a case study of one of our clients, and they were a very paper-based organization. They received the paper, they opened it up. It was a very manual process, routing it around for approval. Inquiries were coming in, via the phone or via mail or via email. There's no purchasing system. They calculated it cost $55 to process a single invoice. When you extrapolate that out to, 1,000 invoices a month or 10,000 invoices a month, you're talking huge amounts of money here that was costing them just to process invoices. So this kind of, I'm not going to go through this in every single way here, along the way here, but you can see this is kind of the transition that they went, the automation process they went here, from completely paper-based to one where they're almost at a touchless processing point where they do as much matching against POs. So invoice comes in, it's matched against a PO, it's matched against a good received. You might have an audit trail associated with that. A PO comes in that's not, or excuse me, an invoice comes in that's not PO based. You can match against a contract or business rules that are set up or a budget. So you're trying to take out the human element and try to have touchless processing all the way through. So they've achieved, a significant gain here. They calculated, the same basis they used before to process an invoice is 55. Now at the end of this journey, and this journey took them, 3 or 4 years process to get to the top here, but at the beginning it was costing them 55, and now it costs them only $4 to process an invoice. So a huge gain that can be had here just by doing more with less and automating the process. So, and finally, our last point here, which I kind of touched on a little bit more with finance and procurement cooperating a little bit more closely, is something that Andrew Bartolini at Arden Partners talks about extensively. A lot of the analysts that we talk to at Forrester and Gardner, also mention this, that as networks grow and people are talking more externally, we have to do a better job communicating internally as well. We have to have the finance and procurement people talking. When the CFO this slide kind of talks about a CFO taking a look at, his organization and what everyone's focusing on and all the problems that are here. If you take a look at the top there, you have the AP department, and they're focusing on the process and control and compliance, making sure that, invoices are received and people, approve them in the right period of time, they comply to all the business rules, who can approve what their approval limits are, and, who has rights to approve what goods. That's what they're interested in. But if you take a look at, what procurement's looking at, we kind of talked about this a little bit before, they look about, what the saving targets are and what the total cost of the good is, and Treasury looks at optimizing cash. How much cash do we need on hand? What credit line do we have? We have one client who, before they purchased our software, one of the main reasons they did was their credit rating was actually reduced because they weren't paying invoices on time. It was delayed, and it got them a lower credit rating there. They went from an A rating down to a high B rating because of this, and that was something that was impacting them. You don't think about this when you think about AP, but if you're paying invoices late, well, guess what? If you're paying it late and your credit rating drops, it's going to cost you more money to borrow money when you want to do capital improvements to your organization. So there's ramifications around. So unless everyone is aligned, there's a lot of ramifications, and that's what I want to kind of stress here. Going in the future, we talked about the network, world we're in. You have to have a network company too. So, at the center of this company, we see the, AP is kind of in the center here. AP has an important role in the organization here, whether it's dealing with the suppliers or procurement or, the greater finance department here. AP is kind of in the center here and kind of the head of disbursements of the money. And if you think about it, it's a great place to do your analysis. It's not doing it in procurement up front, before the fact. When you think about AP, this is the perfect place to do your analysis because you're handling the payments. You know exactly what the commitments are, what the obligations are, and you can then be much more analytical in that role there, and you can handle, take a look at all the things on the left there, the key AP processes, and kind of have AP assume a much more leadership role in the organization of the future. So at this point, we would like to open it up to questions here. I know we covered a lot of information, and as Tom mentioned, what works really well when we do these seminars is the interaction after we kind of present this. We get a lot of the folks talking and interacting. It's not so easy on a webinar, but we'd love to see the questions that you have and kind of open it up to that. So,
hey, Bob, I got a couple questions came through over here on my side.
Yep.
So I think I can add my 2 cents, but I think this first one might be best suited in your hands. And it came in 2 different forms, but it's a question about quantifying the cost of transaction. The spirit of these 2 questions is, it showed up in the analysis in the staircase. How are we, when you move from $50 a transaction to $4 a transaction, is there a universal method to quantify that transactional cost? Or what do you recommend as a best practice? If I'm getting that wrong, send an email over.
It's an excellent question. It's something, it's an interesting point that the question raises. We see these different reports and talks about the cost to process an invoice. And seeing one report it might be $4, and another report, they say, best of breed is $10, and there's lots of different numbers, and you have to take a look at the research that you have by itself, because there is no one universal standard. When you see these reports that analysts do, they may vary significantly from year to year, because there's companies that are figuring out their own cost to process an invoice, and some companies fully load that cost more so than others. In the example that we had here, I can certainly share the information that this customer used in order to figure out what it cost them to process an invoice before as well as post-automation. What's important in any project here, when you're going down the automation path, is figure out what your inputs are. You can determine those. We can help you. We have, a lot of information on the inputs into what goes into the cost of invoice processing. A lot of them you may not think of, but what you want to be is consistent. So when you start that project in the beginning, you find out what the cost per invoice is using all the inputs, and then after you've automated one process or many processes, a year later or 2 years later, whatever it is, you want to benchmark against yourself and that original cost that you had there. So you want to use the same inputs so that the data is valuable here. So kind of a long-winded answer, Tom, and no, there's not one industry benchmark, and it's a great point. You need to be careful about how you look at some of the data that the analysts put out, because there may be no similarities between how one person figures the cost of an invoice to another one. They're good in and of themselves, so you can see what leaders versus laggards are doing, but it's something you definitely need to be careful about.
Hey, there's also just kind of a follow-up to that. I've taken a look at the Aberdeen study, of course, with you, Bob. That came out, I think, within the last year. That had some really good definition around some of the mindset. So I think that will, if we make these slides are available after the presentation, and you can kind of figure out the or drill down into the Aberdeen study, and they can go into more detail about how they're quantifying it for their designation between laggards or industry average or best in class as well.
Yep, and if anybody's interested, I do have an excellent spreadsheet that Penny Gillespie, who's an ex-Forrester analyst, produced kind of on calculating the cost per invoice, and spreadsheet with probably many more inputs than you'd probably ever imagine, ever care to input there, but it kind of gives you a great starting point on calculating that. So if anybody's interested in that, they can just let me know, and I'll be more than happy to email that to them.
Hey, Bob, did you pull any other questions up? I had a couple more that popped up here.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Okay. This is a general one. How do I get information about the seminar series? We specifically have that on the Lavante.com website, so you can find out what cities we're going to. It's also in a future slide here. So you can go to Lavante.com, and Bob, you have a slide on that, or do you have a page on that on your website as well?
We will, yes. We just completed the second round of them, as Tom knows. And sorry, I'm trying to find that slide with going the wrong way here. All
right, so while you're pulling up that slide, there's another question. Okay, great. And then we'll have the dates. So Basware.com or Lavante.com, just go to an events section, and it'll layer in those dates. There's another question here. This is a pretty cool question here. Is how can I get connected to folks that have successfully moved strategic staff to, successfully moved tactical staff to more strategic roles? That's a very cool question. Actually, I'm kicking myself that I don't just have a list at the ready of a number of people who have raised their hands in our seminar series and said, I am doing twice the amount of volume with the exact same number of staff. I haven't had to trim a single head, and we're twice as efficient, twice the number of volume. And we've really been seeing numbers like that. I don't have at the ready, and I should. We probably should have compiled this, a list of those companies and folks. I'll go through my notes and see if I can figure out who that is and distribute it to the person asking this question. But I'd also say as we get in on, as we start seeing trade show season come up, I know that we have a big show in Nashville, a big show coming up in Chicago. It's mattered all over the country. This is one of the biggest functionalities of these shows, is for kind of birds of a feather to get together, or experts in the space to get together and just ask people as much as they can. What I say is, sit at a table and pose the question, hey, you guys, I'm going through X change, whether it's, any of the stuff Bob mentioned, if it's a potential conversation about outsource or offshoring, whether it's a potential conversation about automating, if it's just an edict from the CFO, how do I get this more strategic and proactive behavior out of my staff? And the people that have been through this for good, bad, or indifferent are very knowledgeable, very passionate about it, and just force those conversations. If I can drill down on any of those names who've piped up in our seminars, I'll definitely try to get that out. But when this conversation starts and people have gotten this right, it's a very satisfying conversation about how to get that more strategic mindset in place.
Yeah, Tom, that brings up an interesting maybe action item for us. We didn't think about that. Maybe we can take all the attendees to the webinar and the seminar series that we had and create kind of a group, on LinkedIn or somewhere else that people can kind of communicate with one another, kind of share it. And nothing that's too huge, because, a lot of these groups, you get too many people on there and, asking too many questions, and there's too much commercialization of these things. So maybe it's something that we can look at there and kind of putting something together. But it's a good idea, so maybe we'll take a look at that.
All right, I have another question. This is specific to one of my slides. I'll take this, Bob, and then you can add into it. And then I saw there's another interesting question about networks after this. Tom, you mentioned that you had a client that had 70% response from suppliers and 76% updates for their data. What accounts for the 6% difference? All right, so and I know this person too, so I can take this offline. But if there's any question about that, the larger point is, any process or any undertaking that a company wants to go through will benefit severely by including good data, by infusing good data and refreshed and up-to-date data into the process, whether it's an ERP upgrade or install, whether it's automation, or whether it's a project like we would do for supplier information management, or for vendor, or for supplier credit recovery. So with that in mind, the point is, we got a file that had very limited supplier information in it. And because of our network, we were able to take a lot of missing supplier data and populate it by nature of our network. And we were able to populate it up to a point where 76% of the suppliers had their data updated. Now, once we update their data, we reach out to suppliers and say, hey, can you give us information about whatever we're requesting, if it's contact data, if it's AR balance, if it's financial data, whatever it is. From reaching out to a large percentage of their suppliers, 70% responded, and that was in about an 11 or 12-month period. So sometimes you will update more data than you'll get response, and sometimes you get more response than data. And I hope that clarifies the question. I don't imagine you have much to add to that, Bob. Should I move on to the next question?
Yes, please.
Okay. The next question is, let me see if I can scroll down to this. Oh, can you add a little bit more, let's say, color around the Basware network? And there's some other points to it, but maybe let's just take it open-ended. I can drill down if we don't get to it.
Sure. And one of the questions we get is, what's the difference between an open network and a closed network? And I kind of talked about.
Yeah, that's part of this question. Go ahead.
Okay.
You got it.
And people often ask that, and we talked about, I mentioned earlier that Basware has the largest open e-invoicing network in the world. And what that means is that we allow companies that are already on an e-invoicing network to communicate with other companies on other networks. There's some networks out there where you can only communicate within that network within suppliers on your network. Basware has partnerships with over 130 different e-invoicing networks. So for instance, here in North America, if you're in the chemical industry, you might know Alemica. If you're in the oil and gas industry, you might know Cortex. So we allow companies that are already submitting invoices on the Cortex network or the Alemica network to submit invoices normally, as they normally would, and be received into the Basware network and delivered to a Basware client, or just be received by Basware and delivered to another system that's there. So that's kind of the open network. That's the difference. Is we think, similar to my phone analogy before, if you're on AT&T, how ludicrous would it be that you couldn't call somebody on Sprint or Verizon or T-Mobile? I mean, you wouldn't put up with that. And yet, with e-invoicing networks, it's very much the same things, that most of them are closed these days. And when we talk to, Andrew Bartels at Forrester, he says, what, you guys are on the right path here, but you're probably 5 or 10 years ahead of the game, when it comes to it. There's still money to be made in a closed network. And, we think, Andrew, we don't think we're 5 to 10 years ahead of the game. We think that the future is now, and there needs to be that interconnectivity so that if I'm on a Basware network, I can send an invoice to Cortex, and Cortex can send an invoice to Alemica. We think that's the way to go. So Basware has an open view. So we accept, can send and receive invoices from 130 different networks across the world that are out there, and that's kind of a huge differentiator that we have in the Basware network, e-invoicing network. And we didn't talk about that much here, is one where it enables you to send invoices electronically via 50 different formats. It may be through a print stream from a print driver, it may be through a supplier portal, it may be through true e-invoicing, or it may be through a PDF file or anything along those lines. So the Basware network can send and receive invoices in many different formats that's there, and we've seen phenomenal growth. It's growing over 50% annually. As I mentioned, it's about 25 million invoices a year that went across our network last year, and that totaled almost $200 billion across the network there.
Hey, Bob, I won't lie. I love when anyone gets passionate about their product or really gets excited about it. So to kind of hear you get excited about that, and I know how efficient the network is. We share some clients, and people are always raving about the network and the efficiency of it. But with that, obviously, we're at the top of the hour. Great working with you as always, Bob. We got a couple questions in that we weren't able to answer. We'll definitely get those answers out. I know a recording of this webinar will be available at our website, Lavante.com, and at Basware's website, Basware.com. I want to thank everybody very sincerely for spending an hour of their day with us today. With that, Bob, I'm all in if you'd like to say goodbye.
Yeah, no, I'd like to thank everyone for spending some time with us. Hopefully you found this worthwhile. We do shoot out a quick evaluation questionnaire to you. We'd appreciate if you could provide us with feedback. Was this spot on? Was it helpful to you? What you'd like to see improved? Other topics you'd like to see? And if your city wasn't listed on one for the Future of Accounts Payable, you'd like us to consider coming there. By all means, let us know. This is something.
Especially if you're in Honolulu.
Yes. As you can tell, it's something that Tom and I are passionate about and our organizations are passionate about, and we think this is a great opportunity for people to start thinking about what the future is going to look like and how they can be part of it. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody once again and wish everyone a great afternoon. Thank you.